Okay, let's be honest, who doesn't love a good scary story? And you really can't get more classic than the tale of the Hookman. But what if I told you that campfire story you know is just a shadow of something way more real, and honestly, a whole lot more terrifying? Today, we are digging into the very messed up origins of one of the most famous urban legends ever told.
You know the one. I mean, it's a staple of sleepovers, right? It's been whispered around campfires for decades. A story so familiar it feels like it's just always been there. Everybody thinks they know the tale of the Hookman.
But see, that's the thing about legends. A lot of the time, they have a real starting point. And the story behind this story, it's not just some spooky tale. It's a real-life nightmare of unsolved crime that absolutely haunted an entire town. So the real question is, what actually happened?
All right, before we get to the grim reality of it all, let's just quickly recap the story we all know and love. This is the version that made generations of teenagers think twice about parking on some dark, deserted road.
It always starts the same way. You've got a young couple, they're just looking for a little privacy, parked out under the stars. I mean, it is the perfect setup for a classic horror story.
And then, bam, the beats just fall right into place. The radio crackles with a warning. There's an escaped mental patient with, you guessed it, a hook for a hand. The girl gets totally spooked by this weird scraping noise outside. The boy, he's annoyed. He just floors it to get out of there. They get home, safe and sound, and there it is, the hook just dangling from the car door. He was that close. It's so simple, so effective, and absolutely bone-chilling.
So you have to wonder, where did this specific story with these exact details actually come from? Well, the answer, it turns out, is in a very, very unexpected place.
Believe it or not, the first known written version of the Hookman legend didn't show up in some horror comic or scary story collection. Nope, it was published in the Dear Abby advice column. Some teenagers supposedly wrote in, not even for advice, but just to share this story as a warning to other kids. And it has all the key pieces we just talked about: the couple, the radio warning, and, of course, the hook on the door.
And this letter? It was published on November 8th, 1960. This gives us our first real clue, a date that kind of anchors the legend in modern history. And what's so fascinating is that this date is just 14 years after the real events that almost certainly inspired the whole thing.
Yeah, because this legend wasn't just invented by some concerned parent writing to an advice columnist. Folklorists are pretty convinced it was the sanitized, mutated version of a brutal, real-life crime spree that terrorized a small American town.
So let's go back to the spring of 1946 in Texarkana, right on the border of Texas and Arkansas. A masked attacker started going after couples parked on isolated roads. It began with an attack that, amazingly, 2 people survived. But a month later, another couple wasn't so lucky. And then, less than a month after that, 2 more teenagers were murdered. You can just imagine the panic that gripped the entire region.
I mean, the parallels to the legend are they're undeniable. The attacker, who the papers dubbed the Phantom Killer, targeted couples in parked cars on lonely roads. The police got so desperate they even used teenage decoys to try and bait him. A career criminal named U.L. Swinney was arrested, and his wife even confessed his involvement, but then she refused to testify against him. Swinney was put away for life for other crimes, but the Tarkanana Moonlight murders, they officially remain unsolved to this very day.
So, okay, this is the fascinating part. How does a real-life, unsolved serial killer case morph into a campfire story about a guy with a prosthetic hook? Well, it happens as the story gets passed from person to person, and over time, the real gritty details get warped and replaced with something a little more digestible.
Let's just break down this transformation. The real attacker, a masked gunman, becomes this more folkloric figure, an escaped patient with a hook. The specific real location of Texarkana becomes this generic, placeless lover's lane that could be anywhere in America. The brutal, tragic outcome of actual murder is swapped out for a thrilling, close call where the kids get away. And here's the biggest shift, the source of fear. The real fear was of random, senseless violence. The legend's fear, well, it's a moral one. It's a cautionary tale, basically warning teenagers about sexuality and parking in secluded spots.
So this story, born from a very real tragedy, just took on a life of its own. It embedded itself deep into our culture and honestly became way more famous than the actual crimes that inspired it in the first place. And what's so wild is that the true story also got its own moment in pop culture.
The 1976 horror flick The Town That Dreaded Sundown is directly based on the Phantom Killer's reign of terror. So it's like the story created this whole separate cultural artifact, completely apart from the Hookman legend it also spawned. The Hookman's whole evolution is, it is the perfect example of what an urban legend is. It's a story that's rooted in a possible truth, it gets passed from person to person, and changes along the way. And it usually ends up serving as some kind of a cautionary tale. It's literally modern folklore in action.
So, the next time you hear a spooky story that sounds just a little too wild to be true, it is totally worth asking yourself, where did that really come from? Because so often, the truth is stranger and way, way scarier than fiction. Behind so many of our favorite legends, there's a forgotten history, just waiting to be uncovered.